Hello everyone, welcome to my tutorial on object-oriented programming in Java. Today's tutorial we are going to talk about the constructors. In the last few tutorials we were talking about how to create a new instance, and if we can look at the syntax, let's say I have a my class, okay, and I'm using a reference m1 equals new my class, okay, and then I have another instance I'm creating m2 equals new my class, okay, and my class has a signature like this, I and j. These are the two instance variables that I have defined over here, and whenever I'm using this is what? This is a constructor. That means this one is a constructor. And you can see like this is a blank parenthesis, like there is nothing in between the parentheses here. So there is a specific name for it, and we call that the default or no argument constructor. And now if we look at here, m1 and m2, there are two references, and I have these my class object created a new instance, and in this case I equals 0 and z equals 0, okay, because these are what? These are getting the default values because of integer type. And my class here is again I equals 0 and z equals 0, okay, and this copy and this copy are two separate copies. They are not sharing each other anything. Now because this is a default constructor, that means I am not passing any values, and these instance variables are getting their default values. But there can be some situations where I would like to initialize my instance variables with a predefined value. So in that case what I will do, I will use something called parameterized constructor, okay. And what is that? Let's say I changed m1 equals new my class, okay, and then I'm passing on 2 and 3. So this is something new you haven't seen before in our examples. In this case what I'm doing, I am passing two parameters here, okay, and in the same way I can do 2 equals new my class, okay, and then let's say I'm passing on 5 and 5. So in this case I'm also passing on two parameters there. So in order to do that, in my class I have to define this step. And how do I do that? Let's go again to another page. So my class is like this. I and j. In case you don't define any constructor over here, the compiler will invoke, or the JVM will invoke, the default constructor, which is my class this, okay. So even if you don't define this one in my class, this is okay. But whenever you are going to use a parameterized constructor, you have to define explicitly that within your class. So in here we'll be doing like this: public my class, and then I'm accepting int x, int y, okay, and then I'm saying I equals x and j equals y. So this is an example of a constructor, okay, this public my class, and you can see that it has, this one has an access modifier, and then the name is same of the class name. That means we have to define constructor the name same as the class name, and then we are passing on two parameters, int x and int y, and then whenever we are passing on these two, the value of I gets the value of x and the value of j gets the value of y. So that means, let me write it again, m1 equals new my class, let's say I'm passing on 2 and 3. So in this case the m1 is creating a new object over here in the heap, in my or in the heap memory, okay, and this is having the value of I equals 2 and j equals 3. Because what? Because I'm passing on this to here and this value to here. So 2 is assigned to x and 3 is assigned to y, and then they are assigned over here. So the value of I gets the value of 2 and the value of j gets the value of 3. Okay. Now let's take an example in our coding. So in here I have created two instance variables I and j, and this is a public default constructor and this is another constructor. So that means we can have multiple constructors in a class. This one no argument and this one is a parameterized. We have two values here, int x and int y, and whenever I'm calling this, let's say whenever I'm calling whenever I'm calling like this, m1 equals new my class, so this constructor of the class will be invoked and the new object that I'm going to create is going to have these two values. And so the value of I is having 2 and the value of j is having 3, and I'm using those two values or variables in my this instance method. So now let's go over here. In here I have created 4 instances, C1, C2, C3, C4. C1 is having a default constructor being invoked. Okay. C2 is we are passing on two parameters 4 and 5, and C3 we are passing on two parameters 2 and 3, and over here 5 and 5, and then over here we have invoked the method, and the invocation of the method is same. We call the reference and then invoke the method. Okay, now if we run it, let's see what happens. Okay, so you can see the first print statement is giving us 0 and 0 because we invoked the default constructor, and since the default constructor created a new instance which has the value of I equals 0 and j equals 0, in the second one we have initialized this to 4 and 5, and you can see that the value of c2.i and c2.j is 4 and 5. In the third instance we have passed on two values 2 and 3, and we basically wanted the sum of it, and we then invoked the getSum method, and then we got it 5, and for the next one we got it 10. Okay, so now let's go to again paint what was happening here. So when I invoked C1, this is reference, the class name has to be same, equals new C1, and I passed probably 4 and 5. Let's say I pass 4 and 5. So in my heap, C2, these are references. Okay, I get here C1 class or C1 object with I equals 0 and Z equals 0, and then over here I got the C1 object as I equals 4 and J equals 5. Okay, so we can see there are two instances created, one instance invoked by my default constructor and the other instance invoked by this parameterized constructor. So now let's see that in case if you don't, in case let's say I am okay, and obviously there will be an error here, so I'm going to comment these out. Okay, and then we need to comment this line 2 as well, and then okay, and let's say I'm not going to give any constructor, and now let's run it. So basically it's just int I and j, and whenever I run it, sorry, run as Java application, and you can see that even if you don't pass any parameter, I mean if you even don't create any constructor, you can still invoke the default constructor, which is this one. Okay, but let's say you have invoked or you have created this constructor and you are not passing on any default constructor. In that case you cannot use it. Okay, so in that case you have to have use it. So here is the difference, or here's the rule, that if you don't, number one, if you don't pass any constructor or if you don't create any constructor, you are allowed to invoke the default constructor, which is the no argument constructor. On the other hand, if you define any constructor, let's say this one, but you try to invoke the default constructor, this will be a compile error. Okay, so these are the some of the rules that we need to make clear of. There is another rule that the constructor of a class must have the same name as the class name in which it resides, and then a constructor in Java cannot be abstract, final, static, and synchronized, and access modifier can be used in constructor. So if we again go back to our code here, so that means, see here, this is an access modifier. We can use access modifier, but the difference from a method perspective is that we cannot use a return type here. So even a method doesn't return anything, we can use the keyword void, but in case of constructor we don't use it. Okay, and then we obviously cannot use some of the keywords like final, static for our constructors. So that's it for today. We learned in this tutorial how to initialize our instance variables using the constructor. Thank you.